What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Metal Slug Tactics, a roguelike meets TRPG, utilizing, of course, the Metal Slug franchise. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is linked below as well. Now, in the case of Metal Slug Tactics here, the achievement list is extremely thorough. Though I did want to mention that one or two of the achievements seems a little wonky in the sense that they unlocked when I hadn't fulfilled the requirements right then. For instance, there's an achievement called War Machines for defeating a lot of the regional bosses, which unlocked way after I had initially done that. So there's that. What's more, though, it is also important I tell you, however, that I did in fact get a review key for this particular game. However, I only received it a couple of days before the game launched a couple days ago, on November 5th to be specific, so it took me a little bit to actually, of course, get it done. Now, that said, I did obviously have a bit of a head start on other people, so there's that information for you. But with that out of the way, let's talk about what this game is and what it's all about. So, as I mentioned, this game is a blending of roguelike and TRPG with the Metal Slug universe. Metal Slug is something I was personally not familiar with at all before playing this initially as part of a Steam Next Fest demo a while back, and I had to look into it because I was unfamiliar with it, but apparently this was a series of old arcade games back when, and then in the PS2 era there were a whole bunch of side-scrollers and stuff dedicated to this as well. So for fans of the franchise, it's my understanding there's a bunch of returning characters and people you'll meet and things you'll see that are reminiscent of those, but I fully admit that's not really an experience I can speak much on, as this was my first game in that particular franchise. Now what I can speak on is the tactics side of things. Now I've seen a lot of people compare this to Into the Breach, which is a TRPG from back in, I think it was 2018, back before I was doing reviews as a matter of fact, and there are some similar systems and things there. And while we're going to dive into all of that and more, I would say my broad takeaway for this section of the video is that this is a fun, engaging tactics game that is, unfortunately, a fair bit buggy. Now, luckily, the game is not terribly expensive. I think it launched at a slight discount at $22 US and $25 normally. And considering I got more than 50 hours out of it, I don't think that's a bad value proposition. But I'd say if anything hampers your experience with this one, if you enjoy this genre of games, it's almost certainly going to be a lot of constant little annoying bugs that pop up. Which brings us to our first section of the video, the technical state of this thing. As I mentioned, a lot of little annoying bugs. In fact, there's so many that the developer has already issued a known issues statement over on Steam, basically going over the most prominent stuff that they're dedicated to fixing over the next couple of weeks, which includes things like a variety of different kills not counting towards certain objectives, the game soft locking on you if you use the reset turn feature, profile creation not working if you're using a controller, just regular old visual glitches where if your character dies in a different situation than normal, their arms will just disappear. And personally, the one I ran into that was, I would say, a little more major is that sometimes during boss fights, they will actually transition between different environments, or the map will change as you fight them. And sometimes when that happens, the boss will look to be physically on screen in one place, but then you go to attack it and it's not actually there. It's across the room in terms of where the game thinks it is and where you need to hit in order to actually hit said boss, which could be annoying. Now, most of these issues are, of course, easily worked around, and I wouldn't consider them major problems, but in aggregate, it gets old pretty quick. So from there, let's talk about difficulty of this one. This game does have difficulties. They are not terribly important to the story or anything, and you need to first complete a run on the prior difficulty in order to unlock the next one. So you start at the base default difficulty, and then once you've cleared that at least one time, you can start moving up to, I guess, normal and hard, for lack of a better term, and these difficulties will do things like add different enemy types, and then later on they'll reduce your number of revives you get per run, and you will choose these difficulties per run as well. So again, roguelite, we're going to be making a lot of different runs, and on each individual run you'll pick a difficulty when you start it. Now to that end though, within the run you are on, you're going to be playing through 4 different zones. The order of them is largely up to you, and the zone you start in will always be, of course, a lower difficulty to let you get your characters leveled up and and start picking skills and everything. And then each subsequent zone, regardless of the order, becomes harder and harder as you go. Now, from there, let's talk about the story setup and how that works. Now, right away, as a TRPG and a roguelike no less, there is a story here, but it is not like prominent to the experience. It's really just a vehicle for the combat. But nonetheless, there is a fair bit to go over here, and that is because each character gets their own little individual interactions with other characters, as well as an epilogue that coincides with how the roguelike tells you a bigger story. So right away, eventually, your first goal is simply going to be to clear your first run, like completely finish it, and this happens by defeating Morden, who is leading the rebel army in Sirocco City, and your job is to, of course, push them out. However, when you defeat Morden for the first time, he'll simply run away. Now, after that initial win, when you start your subsequent runs, you're going to notice distress signals for each zone you start in. Each zone you start in will then potentially lead you to a different general, one of Morden's 3 generals. These are the people rescuing him when he runs away. So this leads to 3 extra boss fights, and upon defeating them all, you'll finally gain the information you need to take Morden down once and for all, which basically involves running through the game in a specific order to kill all of his generals first, then his war machines that are always there, and then finally Morden himself, which will give you the true ending. Once you get the true ending, if you have completed all of the story conversations for a character, which involves completing a bunch of different combat achievements generally, you'll then get the epilogue for that character as well. So when you put all of that together, you do have goals for all of these different roguelike runs, and none of it's like insanely in depth or anything, but there's probably more there than you would really expect for this kind of thing. And that brings me to the game's progression systems, which I would say can be divided up into per run progression and then of course more permanent progression. Now, in an individual run, as you complete missions, you'll be gaining XP and everything, and this is going to lead to your characters leveling up, which allows them to pick skills, passives, etc. that coincide for that character with what you've unlocked permanently. There are a few skills that can only be unlocked once you've completed certain things and of course bought them outside of an individual run, which will give you more options for that character. But in a run, this is how you're going to gain skills and everything and all that just to keep up with enemies that are only getting harder as you move through each zone. Now, outside of that, we then have the more permanent progression. Now, first things first, characters. We start the game with 3 characters, Marco, Aerie, and Fio. However, there are 9 in total. To get the other 6, we have to unlock them by completing certain objectives, such as clearing the game or clearing the game after defeating a certain number of zones first, or completing the game broadly with more than one different type of character. That is to say, with each character you have unlocked, you complete a run with them, and you'll unlock more and more of them. Now, each of these characters, of course, has different play styles and equipment and skills to utilize in a given run, each typically honing in on a certain aspect of combat. Now, one of the ways you can add some variance to each of these characters is with their starting loadout. So each character ultimately has 4 different loadouts you can start a run with that you'll be able to unlock and pay for, because after each run, you're given a bunch of cash based on how many missions and zones you've cleared, etc. And you can spend these on unlocking loadouts, skills that you have earned the right to use, and thus can add to the pool of skills and things that can be potentially given when you upgrade your characters in a run, or also buy different mods and things for different weapon types, which can also be unlocked this way to add more variance to what you can do in a given run. So there is a lot of progression both in and outside of the roguelike elements, which are definitely worth knowing about. But that brings us to the gameplay and combat section of the video, which are largely one and the same in a game like this. So let's talk a little bit about how this goes down. Every run you attempt can be divided up into 4 different zones. You won't have access to all of them right away. You have to unlock them just like everything else, but eventually 4 zones at a max. Each one of these zones will have a variety of different missions you can undertake. Now, at a minimum, you have to clear your starter zone, which will then unlock the city for that run, and then you have to ideally clear the city in order to complete a run, because that is where Morden is hiding. So that is the quickest you could do one. However, you can of course go through eventually all 3 of the zones outside of the city before tackling the city itself, which will give you a full run. Each different zone has its own, I would say, aesthetic as well as enemy types, and that's important because each enemy does different things in combat. My personal least favorite was the mummies, because they turn your characters that they hit successfully into mummies as well, and while you can easily kill other other mummies with a fire breath while you are a mummy, it drastically limits your options otherwise. But outside of that, you basically have to pick a mission. Now, each mission is going to give a specific reward. A reward for just clearing the mission, and then a secondary reward for completing a secondary objective. Sometimes these secondary objectives have requirements like kill a certain number of enemies with a certain character. However, sometimes these counters are busted, and if you kill the enemy with, say, the environment or an interactable as an example, it just won't count towards that, kill count, which is not a good time, especially given that some of these missions don't have enough enemies to go around or require you to kill specific enemies in a certain way. But the rewards you can get for any given mission tend to be things like extra mods for your weapons, a reload on ammo because your secondary special weapon requires ammo to actually use and you can run out of it, and sometimes you can even earn assets or just money. Assets in particular are great because these are big moves that you can perform outside of your team's turns, meaning that at zero cost you can use an asset to invoke some effect, such as, for instance, dealing a bunch of damage in an area or summoning in one of the game's vehicles. So it's important to kind of know what does what there and get a feel for the icons and everything. Now, in terms of what each of these missions individually actually is and does, it's mostly just your standard stuff. Sometimes you have to kill everything, sometimes you have to kill specific targets, sometimes you'll have to escort the shop character through the area, other times you need to destroy a convoy before it reaches a given set point. All the usual suspects, basically. Now, if you fail any of these missions, your run ends. And then, in each zone, you need to complete 3 of these missions, mapping your way out as you go before the area boss spawns, and you have to fight it, as you won't be able to do any more missions. And once you take out that boss, you'll be prompted to go to either the next zone or the city in order to continue your run. So that's kind of what this game looks like structurally, but let's actually talk a bit about the combat system at play here. So, combat is obviously where a game like this shines, as it is where all of the focus is. Though, of course, your combat experience is certainly going to vary a little bit depending on the characters you've unlocked and are thus utilizing in combat, which all have their own playstyles. But let's talk about some more general things to know. For starters, the game utilizes a move and action system and then adds some fun elements on top of that. But at a base, every turn your characters get to move and then take an action. Now, as you will be often outnumbered, the action economy is everything here, and utilizing skills and whatnot that you'll unlock that can provide you bonus damage or bonus moves or bonus extra turns, basically, are going to be paramount to victory on top of utilizing your arsenal effectively to take out as many enemies as possible. Now, where the game gets a lot of fun, however, is that movement and running and gunning are a huge part of the experience. This is because your defense is movement. As your characters move so many squares every turn, they gain adrenaline as well as dodge. Adrenaline is what you need to activate your skills, whereas dodge is what is going to reduce incoming damage on the enemy's turn. This can be provided with cover, which is not picky about where you're attacked from, by the way. If you're in cover, no matter what side you're attacked from, it just counts as cover. And that's how you're going to reduce incoming damage. And you can reduce and completely mitigate pretty much all of it this way, including high damage boss abilities. So getting a feel for that and how each character moves can be a huge part of combat. Now, each character, of course, has their unique stuff, like their special actions. Those vary across characters, though some of them do have some crossover that allow you to get a good feel for each character. Now, all of them, however, can perform a synchronization. This is effectively where if they are in range of an enemy you just attacked with another character, they will also attack that character, dealing extra damage, and this is how you're going to take out high health enemies as effectively as possible. Now, against bosses, you can only do this once per turn, but against enemies, it's pretty much as you can possibly trigger. And some characters even kind of revolve around that. You have control characters like Clark or Theo who have the ability to move enemies around the battlefield, basically forcing them into a position to get attacked by synchronization. As an example, you have Leona, the final character you'll unlock, who has the ability to, when she kills an enemy, leave behind an image of herself that, while it won't really do much for you, normally, it does, however, have the ability to tank hits from the enemy, thus, costing them action economy, but also, they will perform synchronizations for you. So if you can kill a bunch of enemies, set up those guys, you can then set up synchronizations with those images, just as an example of something you can do. Now, some characters are a little more focused on high single target damage, like Ralph, who uses a melee weapon normally, and then a shotgun, which is very high damage early on, and combined with some of his skills that give him extra action, missions can go a long way. So a ton of combat comes down to utilizing each one of these characters effectively as well as playing into their strengths, while at the same time engaging with the mechanics of the enemies that are about to attack you, like the mummies that I mentioned, and then of course the boss fights, which have their own mechanics, which typically keep you moving as well. Now, speaking for myself, Marco and Aerie were definitely my favorites. Marco gets an ability called Ricochet, which was just a boss killer, to be honest. Much more effective than any other, as you could hit the boss and then it allows you to ricochet and attack, but bosses are so big that you can ricochet a boss and hit it twice, which is a very similar case for Aerie's Grenade Juggler, which also could do essentially the same thing. And those two together in a party would just wipe the floor with pretty much any boss at any time if you could get those abilities upgraded, which is why they were my favorites, but everybody's got a little something to offer. Now, as combat is in fact grid-based, a lot of your abilities have you focused on your front or your sides, whereas anything going diagonal tends to be a bit of a rarity, and so any ability that does do that is definitely worth keeping an eye on as well, but much of what you're doing is sort of squared off in that manner, which I also wanted to mention here somewhere. So there it is. But before we wrap it up, we then have interactables as well as our vehicles. Interactables are pretty straightforward. Sometimes you'll run up to things in the environment like prisoners that can be saved, or cranes and things that are holding up objects that can be dropped and destroy enemies below them, and you can utilize those effectively in combat to, of course, have some fun. But then we have the vehicles. So, vehicles are assets you can earn throughout your run by completing missions that reward them, typically as a secondary objective. There are more than just vehicles to be earned that way, but you have a tank and a mech you can utilize in combat. These are great because you get to use all of their weapons in a single turn, as opposed to only taking one action for sure outside of, any way that'll grant you bonuses. Now the catch here is these run off of fuel, and moving as well as utilizing your weapons costs fuel, so you can't stay in them forever. Moreover, if the vehicle's armor gets busted through, that character still just dies. However, when characters inevitably die on you, it's not necessarily the end, because there is the reinforcement and the undo mechanics. Now, when your characters move, you will be able to undo that movement provided you have not taken an action. It's also possible to twice per turn reset your turn entirely in order to try again and see how things would play out a little differently. So it is a little bit forgiving in that regard, but when characters die specifically, you can use a point from your reinforcement pool to resurrect them. Now you can earn resurrection points, so to speak, as rewards from missions, which will help you stay in the fight longer, especially if you just kind of get a bad mission draw, which happens sometimes. But certainly be aware that if your entire party goes down in a single turn, you're done. You won't get the opportunity to resurrect them, so at least one of your characters does have to make it through each turn in order to make use of this mechanic. But otherwise, because of everything at play there and all the different characters and things you can do to engage with the system, despite the fact that it does get repetitive and you will see some missions repeat if you play it long enough, like enemy placement and everything stays the same. But in spite of that, with all the different characters and stuff, there's plenty of ways to mix it up. And the combat, the most important part, is a lot of fun, which is where we're going to start wrapping this review up, starting with the Steam Deck section. So this game, like pretty much every TRPG, to be honest, plays very well on the Steam Deck. That platform just works really, really well with this genre, so no surprises there. We've got cloud saves, we've got controller support, all the stuff you would normally want. In fact, the controller support in particular is surprisingly good here, but I will say the one thing to be aware of really is the same problem you're going to have with the base game. Those annoying glitches and things are still present on the Steam Deck, so while it does play very well there, you're just as likely to run into those problems on that platform as you are on, say, PC as well. Which brings us to the positives and negatives. So the positives of this game are, perhaps unsurprisingly, the combat as well as the boss fights and stuff. I think they did a lot of fun stuff there to make it engaging and a good time. Even in a genre that's, let's be honest, is a little oversaturated at this point. We see a lot of TRPGs these days, and this one is a fun addition to that ecosystem. Nonetheless, there are some negatives. The first one should be obvious, the bugs and annoying glitches and things. Like, it's just very, very annoying after a while, and while thankfully none of them are really game-breaking, in aggregate, you're probably going to lose your patience with it after a while. But the other negative for me realistically is that for a roguelike even, the game's just kind of light on content. There's really not that much to it, unless you are specifically trying to get all of the conversation options for each character, which was by far the longest part of this particular 100%. But in order to get those conversation options, you're going to have to run through the same 4 zones, which eventually will cause you to see a bunch of repeating missions in each individual zone, and you're going to stop seeing new stuff probably like by 10 or 15 once you've unlocked all the characters, until you see that true ending. But because of the story-like nature of it, the epilogues that you'll unlock by doing all of this, I wouldn't say are like revolutionary or anything, meaning that the reward doesn't quite fit the time investment as far as I'm concerned. So the repetition of a relatively small amount of content will eventually make every run feel like the same run. Which brings me to my conclusion. So, Metal Slug Tactics is a bombastic, pixelated TRPG that has really fun combat, at least for like 15 to 20 hours, I would say. And while I would not consider much of anything this game does to be revolutionary or anything, it is, more than anything, a fun time for a couple dozen hours at least. Now, on the other side of that though, in order to enjoy that fun, you're going to have to put up with some annoying bugs that definitely drag the experience down, and that, combined with, again, just not a ton of content in general, would normally lead me to give this a buy on sale. But honestly, the game is already pretty cheap at $25 US. So I'm not terribly concerned about price here. My general advice would simply be to hold off until they get most of these more annoying little problems sorted out here in a couple months. They've said that they're actively working on a lot of these things, so we'll see if that materializes. But once that's fixed, or if they just don't bother you that much, I think there's a lot of fun to be had here, and it will be worth a buy once that happens. And I even managed to enjoy it in spite of those things. Though this is definitely one of those games I probably wouldn't recommend most people 100% because, frankly, it was a lot. But I think that's where we're going to wrap up this particular review, so hopefully you enjoyed it, found it informative. If you did, certainly let me know about it down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.